Wind came off the prairie like a living thing, flat, fast, and full of grit, scraping across the frozen grass and whistling through the gaps between the new-built houses. The sky had the color of old tin. It was late afternoon, and the sun hung low enough to throw long shadows from every fence post, every wagon tongue, every crooked chimney in the little settlement of Alder Creek. Elias Crow tasted iron in the air before he saw the first hard snow. Not flakes yet, just that dry, metallic smell that meant the cold was tightening its fist. He had maybe 9 minutes before the light bled out and the temperature dropped another notch, and he needed those minutes for one thing: to get below the wind line. Behind him, the street looked like a sketch made from soot. A few men stood outside the livery, shoulders hunched, watching him with the same expression they'd worn since he arrived. Half amusement, half suspicion. Their laughter didn't carry far in the wind, but Elias saw it in their faces. He didn't answer. He just kept walking with his shovel over one shoulder and a coil of rope cutting into his other hand like a promise. The plot he'd bought sat on the edge of town, where the ground rose a little and the creek bent away. Most folks wanted a view, wanted a porch facing the main road, wanted to show they were staying. Elias wanted the opposite. He wanted earth between himself and the weather. The first time he sank the shovel into the soil, the sound surprised him. A dull, dense thud, not the crisp ring of stone. Under the top crust of frozen dirt was heavier ground, packed with clay and roots. That was good. Clay held shape if you treated it right. Clay also held water, and water was a patient enemy. He would have to outthink it. He worked in short, hard bursts, throwing soil into a growing berm to the north and west. That berm wasn't just a pile. It was a windbreak by morning. Every scoop was doing 2 jobs. The plan in his head wasn't fancy. It was old sense, the kind you learned when you'd slept in too many places where walls were only a suggestion. Wind stole heat by stripping away the warm air layer around a house. Make the wind work to reach you, and you bought time. Put yourself below grade, and you stepped out of its mouth. He set stakes and string, measuring a rectangle with deliberate care. The chamber would be just big enough for one man, maybe 2 in a pinch, roughly 12 feet by 16, with a ceiling he'd keep low so it could be supported without timber he didn't have. He dug an entry trench first, angled so the prevailing wind wouldn't blow straight into it. A straight doorway was a mistake out here. Wind found straight lines the way water found cracks. When the sun finally slipped behind the far rise, the cold rushed in, as if someone had opened a door to a cellar. Elias's fingers went numb, then painful, then numb again. He kept digging anyway, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant hearing the laughter. He'd heard worse in other towns. Mole, someone had called him the day he asked about buying scrap pipe. Going to live like a badger, another man had said, loud enough for the whole store to catch it. Elias didn't mind being called strange. He minded being called unprepared. He paused only once, standing in the trench he'd started, shoulders below the level of the prairie wind. Up here, the gusts slapped faces and rattled loose boards. Down here, the air was suddenly calmer, still cold, but not clawing. That difference, just a few feet of earth, was the whole argument. He looked back toward town. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin, confident lines, as if winter was a thing you could manage with a stovepipe and good intentions. Elias watched one roofline flex slightly when a gust hit it, a subtle shiver that made his jaw tighten. They were building to stand up tall against the sky. He was building to disappear. He went back to work until the last light died completely, then climbed out and laid a tarp over the trench, weighting it with stones so it wouldn't snap and sail away. The tarp wasn't a roof. It was a marker, proof he'd started, and a small shield against drifting snow. As he walked to the tiny room he'd rented for the night above the blacksmith shop, the wind rose again, angry at being denied. Elias felt it push at his back like a hand. In his mind, he He saw the house he meant to carve under that plot. Earth walls, a low ceiling, a door that didn't invite the storm inside. He also saw the town's faces when the real weather arrived, and their confidence turned into pleading. Not yet, he thought. Soon enough. By morning the tarp was stiff with frost, and the berm Elias had thrown up had a skin of powdery snow already packing into its leeward side. The wind hadn't stopped. It never did. It only changed its mind about direction, as if testing every angle of the town for weakness. Elias returned to the plot with a tin of nails, a handsaw, and 2 lengths of scavenged plank he'd paid too much for. He needed a temporary lip for the trench, something to keep the top edge from crumbling while he dug deeper. A clean-cut wall held better than one that slumped. He was setting the first plank when the sound of boots on hard ground told him he'd gained an audience. "Morning, Crow," said a voice that carried confidence the way some men carried rifles. Elias glanced up. Sheriff Dalton Ames stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, coat collar up, eyes narrowed against the glare of snow. Behind him were 2 townsmen Elias recognized from the livery. Harlan Pike, broad as a barn door, and a younger man named Whit Morrow, who always looked like he was waiting for permission to laugh. Dalton didn't step closer. He studied the trench the way a man studied a hole he might have to pull someone out of. "You're digging a grave?" Whit asked. Harlan snorted. "No, graves are for the dead. He's making a home for the living. That's worse." Elias kept his hands on the plank until it stopped trembling from the wind. "It's a winter house," he said. "It's lower than the wind. That's the point." Dalton's gaze flicked to the berm and back. "Folks say you aim to stay down there all season." "Folks say a lot." "They also say it ain't right," Harlan put in. "A man's supposed to build up, show he's part of the place. What you're doing looks like you're hiding from God and neighbors." Elias felt heat rise behind his ears, not from shame, but from the old frustration of being judged by people who'd never had to sleep through a storm with nothing but a blanket and a prayer. He kept his voice even. "Wind doesn't care if a house is proud," he said. "It cares if it can get under the roof and pull. It cares about corners and gaps. Put your walls in the air, and you're giving it handles." Whit laughed at that, quick, sharp. "Handles. Listen to him, like the wind's a thief." "It is," Elias said. "It steals warmth. It steals boards if you let it. It'll find a loose shingle like a gambler finds a weak man." Dalton crouched, picked up a handful of soil from the berm, and let it sift through his fingers. "You're counting on dirt to hold." "I'm counting on the ground not to blow away," Elias replied. "Dirt's heavy. Wind can't lift it. If I keep the roof low and arched, the load goes into the walls. No tall sides for gusts to slam." Harlan's mouth twisted. "And when it rains, you'll be swimming." Elias had expected that one. "That's why I'm uphill from the creek, and why the floor will sit higher than the entry. Water runs to the low point. I'll give it a low point that isn't my bed." Whit stepped closer, peering down into the trench, as if he expected to see madness piled at the bottom. "So you're telling us you'll be warmer under the ground than in a proper house with a stove?" Elias pointed at the frozen earth beside the trench. "Down 2 feet, the temperature doesn't swing as wild. The ground holds yesterday's warmth. You fight less cold. A stove inside a tall, drafty room just feeds heat to the wind." Dalton rose, expression unreadable. "You got timber for a roof down there?" "Not timber like you mean," Elias said. "I'll use poles and planks to make ribs, then sod and soil on top. The weight keeps it tight. No shingles to peel." For a moment the 3 men were quiet, listening to the wind rake the prairie. In that pause, Elias thought he might have reached something in Dalton, some practical part of him that weighed risk and didn't care about pride. Then Harlan spat into the snow. "If you want to bury yourself, that's your business. But don't come crying when it caves, and don't expect town to dig you out." Whit grinned. "Maybe we'll put a chimney on top so we can find you." Dalton held up a hand. Not quite a warning, not quite a blessing. Just don't make trouble, Crow. Winter makes enough on its own. They walked off, their backs straight against the wind, leaving Elias with the cold and the silence that followed mockery. He watched them go, then looked down at his trench. It didn't feel like a grave. It felt like an argument he intended to win. The frost line deepened over the next week, and every swing of Elias's shovel hit harder ground. He worked by habit, 3 hours before dawn, 2 after sundown, so the townsfolk rarely saw him, except when he came up to trade or haul. By then, word of the burial house had spread clear to the rail stop. From above, it still looked like a long wound in the earth, but below, the shape was taking form. The main chamber was now shoulder height, with cut shelves carved directly into the clay walls. Elias ran his hands along them, testing for crumble. The clay was cold, but held its edge. When it dried, it would set like brick. That was the beauty of this soil. It punished the lazy but rewarded patience. He set up a half-dug bench using a plank and 2 shallow niches. The space was narrow but steady. Every few feet, he left vertical ribs of untouched earth, natural pillars to bear the weight of the ceiling. Those ribs would take the stress if the roof shifted under snow. While he worked, his mind did the arithmetic every builder does alone. Snowpack weight versus arch angle, soil cohesion against frost heave, time against daylight. He whispered numbers as he cut, not out of habit, but out of reassurance. Numbers meant the earth could be reasoned with. That afternoon, old Mrs. Fallon from the mill house approached with a bundle under her arm. Her coat flapped like an open sail. "Crow," she called from the edge, "you picking a fight with the Almighty, or just the wind?" He smiled, but didn't pause. "Neither. I'm just giving both less to work with." She peered down. "Looks like a cellar that got ambitious." "Cellar is the right idea," he said, clearing loose dirt from a wall. "Just bigger and livable. You think it'll keep warm come January?" "I think the ones above ground won't." He looked up at her. "Cold can't steal what it can't reach." She studied him another moment, shook her head, and unwrapped the bundle, a coarse sack of dried beans. "You've gone strange, but I respect stubborn. Take these. You'll need them if that pit of yours closes on you." He thanked her quietly, watching her silhouette disappear against the white glare of town. That was Alder Creek's mercy. Laughter from the strong, kindness from the lonely. As he laid the framework for the roof ribs, Elias worked by lamplight. He scavenged 4 ash saplings and trimmed them into arcs, pinning their bases into the clay ribs. 2 planks ran lengthwise across the arches, braced by pegs. When he stepped back, sweat freezing on his collar, the skull of the place finally looked right. An underground chamber with a curved back strong enough to bear a storm. He lined the upper surface with brush first, then layered sod squares on top, wet soil facing down to knit into the brush as it froze. The heavier earth followed, 6 inches, tamped flat with a board until every hollow filled. A packed earthen roof, if done right, worked like a single muscle. It didn't resist the wind, it absorbed it. By morning, the inner space had gone utterly still. Elias struck a match. The flame didn't flicker sideways, it rose straight. That confirmed what the design promised: minimal draft, stable pressure. He set about cutting an entry hatch from split boards, angled downward by 20 degrees, so snow would slide rather than pack. Then he built an interior lip 2 feet inside the door, a small rise to trap warm air. He tested it by sitting against the wall, breathing slow. Even with no fire, the chill here was temperate, almost mild. That evening, clouds began to pile low and grey, and distant thunder rolled though no lightning showed. The first storm of the season was organizing itself somewhere past the river. Elias crawled from the trench, stood on the berm, and scanned the horizon. Town lamps blinked gold and small below him. Chimneys smoked straight against the darkening sky. They looked secure now, proud little lampposts of human order. He tightened his coat, thinking of Dalton's measured stare, Harlan's smirk, Whit's laughter. Let them laugh, he thought. When the wind comes, it won't care who prayed hardest. He stowed his shovel, laid the hatch plank, and pressed the edges into their groove until no light leaked through. Inside, only his breath moved. The quiet here wasn't emptiness. It was design. By late November, Alder Creek had settled into its winter rhythm. Stoves burning from dawn, constant sound of chopping wood, white smoke crawling low through the streets. To most of the town, survival meant seeing another sunrise with fingers still warm enough to hold the axe. To Elias, it meant balance, heat, air, and dryness in delicate agreement. The underground house had kept him alive through the first frost week, but a new enemy had crept in, air that turned stale and damp, thick enough that even a shallow breath made his head buzz. The lamp burned weakly. That meant not enough oxygen. He crawled to the hatch and wedged it open 2 inches, but a gust shot in carrying dry snow that instantly melted on the warmer clay. The trickle of meltwater pooled near the entry, threatening to soak deeper. Poor exchange either way, suffocation or wet rot. Elias sat for a moment, palms pressed to his knees, thinking back on every root cellar and camp he'd slept in. Air needed a path, one vent to feed, one to exhaust. He had neither yet, only hope and stubborn lungs. He took a pick, broke through a channel upward along the north wall, and inserted a 4-foot scrap of stovepipe he'd scavenged from the smith. He wrapped the outside mouth with a hood made from flattened tin, bending it like an awning. The lower end he packed with straw to act as a filter against snow. That would pull fresher air in when pressure dropped inside. The exhaust was trickier. A second pipe, thinner and longer, would climb outward through the ceiling ridge at a slant. He angled it toward the lee side so the prevailing wind would pass above, drawing the stale air out by suction. Primitive but effective, the same principle as a chimney's draft without the smoke. He stoked the tiny iron heater he'd built from an oil drum half cut. Fire flared yellow, then blue, eager again. His chest loosened. Still, moisture clung to everything. The clay walls gleamed faintly, and his blanket smelled of cold wool and metal. He fixed that next. Above the sleeping ledge he carved, Elias drove slim holes to create what he called relief breaths, small vents that allowed trapped humidity to seep out toward the outer soil. Then he coated the lower wall with a layer of sand and ash mixed with melted tallow. Crude, but it sealed the damp. He checked the heat gradient by touch, warmest near the stove, softer by the far wall, steady underfoot. The air had become livable again, though the low ceiling forced him to stoop with every movement. He didn't mind. Earth pressed close was a comfort of its own. It hummed, alive and patient. That evening, while the town gathered at the small church for prayer meeting, a voice carried down the slope outside his shelter. "You in there, Crow? Or did you crawl clean underground?" It was Whit, his laughter barely muted by the wind. "Dalton says the frost'll break pipes this year. Maybe your cave'll catch a cold." Elias smiled to himself, unseen. He let the wind answer for him. Its howl swallowed Whit's noise before another word. He wrote a note in his pocket ledger anyway, steady block letters in pencil. Intake, exhaust, seal, all hold against gale. Draft strong, air steady. Potential for 2 occupants if ration heat. Then he shaded a sketch of his vent layout. He wasn't just making shelter anymore. He was making proof. At midnight, he woke to the sound of something delicate, tiny crystals tapping against the vent hood. Snow beginning again. Through the low gap of the hatch, he could smell the cold. Metallic, sharp, relentless. He rose, checked both pipes. The intake drew a faint whistle. The exhaust exhaled soft plume through a cloth he had tied over the end as a frost guard. It worked. He could breathe asleep now. Above him, the wind increased, rattling faintly through the sod roof. a restless hand searching for purchase it would never find. Somewhere up in town, doors banged shut, and unseen shutters broke loose. Elias tamped the coals, lay back against the packed wall, and whispered like a man promising himself a secret. Let it come. I'm ready to breathe through the storm. The thaw arrived too early that year, one of those deceitful warm spells that make men hang coats on porch rails and brag about the mercy of the season. For 3 days the air lost its bite. Roofs dripped, the creek loosened its skin of ice, and Alder Creek's streets turned into mud thick as soup. Down in the underground house, that same warmth translated into trouble. The berm to the north began bleeding moisture inward. At first, Elias thought it only surface melt, but by the second evening, cold droplets traced down the clay wall and gathered near the floor, soaking his stacked wood pile. He woke before dawn to the squelch of his own boot prints and the smell of wet earth turning sour. One more night like that, and the whole shelter risked saturation. Clay that absorbed too much water lost its grip. It could slump, or worse, shear when the next freeze came. Elias opened the hatch and listened. Above ground, the town sounded almost cheerful. Hammering, horses, the creak of wagons trying roads again. He scraped out a side trench, channeling the seep toward the outer slope. But gravity alone wouldn't be enough. He needed a deliberate system. He fetched broken gravel from near the creek bend and poured 2 sacks worth into the new cut, layer by layer. A drain wasn't just a pipe, it was a set of choices. Big stones let water through while holding back silt. Finer grit behind them filtered again. He angled the run downward by 2 inches per foot, measuring roughly with the handle of his spade until the trickle ran clean. By afternoon, the floor had begun to dry. He built a raised bed frame from old fencing boards, elevating his blanket a foot above ground. Under it, he stowed sacks of wool and straw, not exactly insulation, but enough to trap a cushion of air. In a structure like this, every inch of separation counted. Air was the cheapest wall a man could invent. When the sun dipped, the damp earth already hardened again. Elias watched steam rise from the berm where the wind hit wet clay, then cool into faint ice at the crest. Nature doing the opposite dance every man did here. Melt, freeze, melt again. He recorded the fix in his ledger. Drain works, bed elevated, roof infiltration 0. He almost allowed himself satisfaction until a coughing fit seized him. The chill from that damp night had gotten into his lungs. Later that evening, voices came from the slope above. Dalton's rough drawl mixed with others. Elias listened without climbing up. "Storm out east," Dalton was saying. "They say barns ripped clean in Lee's Hollow. Wind strong enough to roll a wagon 40 paces. Harlan answered, "Won't be that bad here. Frost broke, ground won't hold drift." "Maybe," Dalton said. "Still, you ever notice that fool crow down there never leaves? Man must think weather's hunting him." More laughter. Elias stared at the clay wall, whitened now by his breath's frost. He murmured to the emptiness, "You laugh because you've never seen the land change its mind." He set about his night routine. Check fire pit, cover vents, test the hatch seal. The earth above groaned faintly as the temperature swung again. First the sound of soft trickle, then brittle snaps as it refroze. A rhythm older than the town, indifferent to men's wages. For a few hours, peace held. Then, past midnight, a new sound came. Distant thunder without lightning, rolling along the plains. Snow again, carried by a colder air mass returning with vengeance. Elias added notes in his ledger with a trembling hand. Thaw lesson. Water always seeks low place. Must divert before it remembers me. He underlined it twice. The warmth had been brief, but it had revealed the enemy beneath comfort. Complacency. Above, the town surely slept smiling, dreaming of early spring. He knew better. The change of wind was thick as omen. When he finally shut his lamp, Darkness filled the chamber like solid water. He repeated his mental checklist: vents, drain, heat, stores, and listened until the house began to hum softly again, with the world freezing back to stone. Tomorrow they'd laugh again at Crow's Cave. Tomorrow he'd start reinforcing the roof seam just in case. Because the ground had whispered tonight, a low sound, older than words, that peace was only a pause in the argument. A week later, the air turned mean again, colder, sharper, and full of static that made horses shy at fences. The sky pressed low, as if weighed down by something unseen. The people of Alder Creek started talking more about the stranger's hole than about the church roof or mill repair. It had become entertainment to imagine what went on beneath the dirt. At the general store, Elias found himself the center of a different kind of warmth, the laughter of a crowd kept brave by proximity. "Here he is," Whit called when he walked in, his grin broad. "The man who sleeps with worms." Even Harlan, leaning on a sack of flour, joined in. "Guess he's got a burrow for when the storm blows. Maybe he'll lend us some room if the sky falls." Elias set his list on the counter, asking for kerosene, flour, and salt. The storekeeper hesitated, half smiling. "A bit early to hole up, ain't it? Storm's not started." "I'd rather be ready a day early than a day late," Elias said. The storekeeper's wife sniffed. "A day early's what the mad ones call eternity." The voices were friendly on the surface, but every word rapped a hook. Elias took his supplies without answering further. As he turned for the door, Sheriff Dalton entered from the street, bringing a knife of cold air with him. "Crow," Dalton greeted, "you done fortify that molehill of yours?" Elias looked at him evenly. "Finished enough to test." Dalton ordered tobacco, then joined the laughter. "You know, there's talk you've been writing a manual down there. Maybe we can use it if our roofs blow away." "Maybe you should," Elias said quietly, "before that happens." For a heartbeat, silence prickled. Then Harlan barked a laugh, and the store filled with noise again. Dalton only smiled thinly, but his eyes measured Elias the way a man measures weather, half in disbelief, half in worry. When Elias stepped outside, the wind bit so deep it felt alive. The sky had gone to milk gray, shredded by darker ribbons. He watched smoke from chimneys twist violently and then flatten sideways. That was no ordinary gust. It was a front rolling fast from the north. He'd seen one like it years ago in another territory. Roofs went first, then timbers, then men if they didn't lie flat. Back at his plot, he inspected every edge of the roof. Frost seams had sealed perfectly after the last freeze, and his gravel drain showed no standing water. Satisfied, he checked his vents, tied down the hatch cover with chain instead of rope, and packed extra soil along the berm. Then he stood for a moment on the surface, looking down toward town. The place looked peaceful under its film of ice. Smoke, fences, the distant bell tower. Beauty, born of ignorance. He returned underground, just as the first sleet began to rattle against the hatch. That night, wind moaned like a storm rehearsing its lines. The barometer Elias kept, an old metal dial salvaged from a freighter's crate, dropped 2 marks in 3 hours. He traced the needle with a finger, exhaled once through his nose, and wrote only 5 words in his ledger. Judgment coming sooner than thought. By morning, the light filtering through the vent holes was yellow-gray, thick. Snow began as fine powder, then grains, then sheets driven sideways. Outside, distant crashes echoed, barn doors slamming open, milk pails rolling, shingles tearing free. Inside the earth house, everything stayed in its place. Air pressure hummed steady through his intake. The stove flickered patiently, the vent breathing slow and sure. Elias set a pot of melted snow over the heat and sat listening to the chaos outside, marking each type of sound, boarding, splitting, cursing. The world above him was proving his argument without words. Still, a strange guilt tugged at him. He wasn't happy to be right, not yet. Survival wasn't victory, it was just endurance. At dusk, knocking came at the hatch. A woman's voice trembled above. "Elias, you there?" He opened the cover a crack. Mrs. Fallon stood hunched in blowing snow, coat wrapped to her chin. "Dalton says Windle Crest by midnight," she shouted. "Said to stay off the streets. Harlan's roof already peeled halfway. They're trying to nail it back." "Tell him to get his family low," Elias said. "Basement, if he's got one. Earth is safer than air tonight." She nodded through the spin of ice, eyes wide, then stumbled back toward town. Elias sealed the hatch, fastened the chain, and pressed his forehead against the packed roof. Above that thin boundary, the storm was baring its teeth. Down here the air stood still, patient. He whispered the same phrase he'd used since the first shovel hit the ground. "They'll understand soon enough." The wind outside howled like something agreeing. By the next dawn, there was no dawn, just a grey weight pressing down where the horizon should have been. Snowfall had turned to a white roar, and the town above was nothing but outlines under drifts. Inside the shelter, Elias listened to the storm breathe through the vents like a colossal beast. The barometer needle had vanished under frost. He had enough food for 10 days, but curiosity, itself a dangerous hunger, made him tug on his coat and lift the hatch just an inch. Wind clawed in instantly, throwing fine crystals across his face. Through that slit, he saw only a wall of moving white, and what looked like the tip of his own shovel still stuck upright yesterday. Everything else erased. He dropped the hatch and braced it again, chest hammering. The weight of snow on the roof was rising. He could feel a faint compression in the air, as though the ground above him had grown heavier by the hour. Time to strengthen what mattered. He unlaced his boots partly, so he could grip with his toes. Balance and touch mattered down here. Moving quickly, he took the final 2 beams he'd saved, a pair of rough-cut cottonwood planks, and wedged them across the central span as braces. He hammered until their ends bit into the clay ribs, feeling tremors ease. Then he shoveled fresh earth along the interior base of the walls, compacting it to spread the weight. The shelter was now sealed against the world, 2 vents whispering, 1 small stove, silence otherwise. He measured the oxygen by instinct. 1 tiny lamp flame, steady and thin. Safe enough for now. His next worry was fuel. He had less than a sack of kindling left. If the vents iced over, he'd suffocate before freezing. If he closed them, fire would stall. A brutal equation. So he banked the coals beneath a lid of ash to stretch hours into half days, and wrapped his blanket twice around knees and chest. 9 hours later, though it might have been 2 or 20, the sound changed. The roar broke into uneven crashes, like distant trees snapping. He pressed his ear to the wall. The vibrations arrived in steady rhythm. Collapse, pause, scream. That rhythm meant one thing only: structures giving way in sequence along the street line, roofs tearing as wind found the eaves. Instinct screamed to surface, to see. But reason answered louder. Stay low. Once you break a seal in weather like this, you might never close it again. Instead, he worked the vent sticks with his gloved hand, knocking loose any crust. Every breath of air that returned was a victory. Water condensed along the ceiling and froze into lace. Somewhere above, voices rose, screams, then muffled thuds, then nothing but wind again. He closed his eyes and pictured the town roofs, each one proud and tall 2 days ago, snapped now like the lids of empty boxes. By the second night, silence fell, unnatural, total. He didn't know if the storm had passed or merely paused to think. He tested the hatch. It wouldn't move. He pressed harder, shoulders straining. The lid gave half an inch before the chain tightened. Packed snow had welded it shut. He smiled grimly. Point of no return, he muttered, trapped by his own correctness. He shifted to the backup plan. From the storage nook, he pulled his spade and began tunneling upward along the entry slope, using hand strokes to feel weakness in the snow. The air thinned. Ice dust showered down, cold sting in the eyes. But then a thin glow appeared ahead. White light diffused through snow layers. He set his shoulder against it and punched once. Snow cascaded inward, dazzling him with brilliance. He had broken through, far above where the original hatch now lay buried. The world outside was unrecognizable. Every fence, door, and roof peak had vanished into drifting mounds taller than men. A single chimney jutted like a black finger from the whiteness. Nothing else moved. The wind moaned lower now, spent, but still cruel. Elias hauled himself halfway out, gasping on the ridge of his own berm. He saw where his makeshift tunnel landed, barely 10 paces from the spot where his shovel marker had stood. The marker was gone, his roof invisible under 3 feet of storm pack. Through the swirling white, he glimpsed wreckage farther down, the skeletal remains of a barn, boards twisted, nails flashing faintly when the clouds opened. He understood enough. The test had begun before anyone meant it to. He dropped back into the warmth of the earth and sealed the tunnel mouth with a slab of snow, careful to leave a gap for air. Then he sat beside the stove and watched his breath curl upward. 5 words again, whispered between heaves of relief and dread. They'll know when dawn comes. And above, the dawn was taking its time. Morning broke as a dim reflection. No sun, just the hint of difference between darkness and light. The air inside the shelter had cooled to near freezing, but motionless, dry. Elias crawled back through the tunnel he had cut and emerged into silence, unlike any he'd known. Even the wind seemed exhausted, breathing only in long, ragged sighs. What had been Alder Creek was now a single white plain punctured here and there by black gaps. Some weren't chimneys. They were holes where houses had folded inward. A roof beam protruded, splintered and rimed with ice. No walls left to claim it. The smell was wrong too. Wet timber, coal smoke, old smoke. He heard something faint, a human cry between cough and calling. It came from the direction of the church square. Elias squinted and saw what might be movement at a collapse mound. He started toward it, steps slow through chest-deep snow, each one pressing air from the drift with a dull thump. His gloves froze stiff almost at once, but he didn't stop until he reached the mound. A hand showed, skin grey in the light. He pulled, breaking snow free with his spade, until a face appeared. Dalton, eyes slitted, lips raw but alive. The sheriff's hand caught his coat sleeve, as if afraid the contact might dissolve. "Crow," he rasped. "We lost. Everything." "Save breath," Elias said, digging fast. Under the man's body, something shifted. A second figure, maybe Whit, coated in frost. Between the two of them, the whole corner of the church wall lay crushed, pinning their legs. Elias levered a plank under the rafters and pushed until it cracked enough for Dalton to crawl free. Whit followed, limping, blood dark against the snow. They both stared at him, as though he had stepped out of a dream. "Your place," Dalton managed. "Can it hold 3? "It already held one through the night," Elias answered. "That's proof enough." By the time they reached his berm, more voices called through the white maze. Mrs. Fallon, 2 children covered in soot streaks, and Harlan himself, staggering beneath a torn blanket that once was his roof. Word spread quick. Crow's burrow still stood. They reached it one by one, faces blue with cold, disbelief spreading as they saw the open tunnel mouth. The entrance looked like nothing, just a slit of shadow, but when they crawled in, the change shocked them. The air was laced with residual warmth, faint smell of ash and earth instead of death and splinters. Whit sank near the stove, staring at the low ceiling. "Feels like hiding inside a heartbeat," he whispered. Harlan laughed once, dry, broken. Guess the mole knew what he was doing. Elias added wood to the coals and passed his last tin of tea flakes into Dalton's shaking hands. They brewed in silence, each man unwilling to speak first. Finally, Dalton said what none of them dared guess aloud. The town's gone. Outside, a low groan rolled across the drifts, some structure finally surrendering. Elias watched the thin vent pipe tremble overhead, but hold firm. The design was doing its job, balancing internal and external pressure so nothing buckled. The heavier the snow, the tighter the seal. When heat rose again in the chamber, condensation fogged the packed walls. The children stopped shivering first. Shelter always forgives youth fastest. "Why'd we never think of this?" Mrs. Fallon murmured. "We spent years building against the wind, instead of with it." Elias spoke quietly. "Same reason men build towers when they're afraid of the sky. Pride's a poor insulator." Dalton nodded, eyes distant. "You'll write down how you did it. The town'll need to rebuild. Better." "If there's a town left to read," Harlan muttered. Yet even he helped feed the fire. Through the vent came a muffled rumble. More houses shifting, perhaps another collapse farther off. None of them moved toward the sound. Down here, under 6 feet of authority called gravity, they had found the only stillness left on the prairie. Elias didn't smile. He only felt the steady pulse of the roof above, alive with weight, yet unyielding. His house wasn't defying nature, it was cooperating. By the evening, the storm finally broke its hold. Air pressure lifted, the whine of the wind fading to a hush, but none of them dared surface until the last moan flattened into calm. Elias marked the date in his ledger by lamplight, each stroke heavy, deliberate. Night the roofs left. He underlined it once, then turned the page small between his fingers, leaving space for what came after, the accounting. By the next morning, a thin blue light seeped through the vent holes, first proof the storm had truly gone. The world above was reborn in silence, no motion save the sparkle of ice crusting every drift. Elias waited another hour before unsealing the tunnel mouth. Warm air from inside rose in a curling column, meeting the brittle cold like smoke. He climbed out first. The surface dazzled and blinded him, one endless sheet of snow broken by wreckage. Roofs and fences were gone. The shapes that remained were only heaps and hollows. The church steeple lay sideways, its bell half buried, a frozen tongue poking through snow. Behind him Dalton emerged, limping but determined, followed by Whit and Mrs. Fallon, carrying one of the children wrapped in blankets. They looked around without speaking. "Stay close," Elias said. "The drifts are crusted but thin. Step where I step." Moving cautiously, they made their way toward the remains of the main street. The drifts rose almost to what used to be second-floor windows. Elias paused at a gap where a roof had collapsed inward. He recognized the general store sign, half torn but still legible. Under the broken beam lay the outline of Dalton's office and Harlan's livery, gone without argument. "God," Dalton breathed. It tore the place clean off the map. Elias crouched, brushing away snow until he found a frozen board. When sunlight hit it, the grain showed a strange polish, edges scoured smooth by unthinkable wind speed. "The storm didn't just fall on us," he said. "It rolled like a tide. You can see the direction in the scoring." Whit pointed to the distant ridge. "That way. It came straight through." Elias nodded. Tall structures, steep roofs, all caught it full. Anything flat or buried diverted the lift. Once the first roof peeled, the suction did the rest. Dalton turned to him. "You're saying it pulled the houses apart?" "Exactly. Wind undercuts like a crowbar. The air pressure outside drops faster than inside. The walls burst from within. Same law that makes a stove draw." Mrs. Fallon stared at the horizon, eyes wet against the glare. "And yours held because the wind never had anything to grab," Elias finished softly. "The earth took the load evenly. No corners, no lift point, just weight against weight." They wandered farther until they found the Fallon homestead. Stovepipe, a door, and a single patch of brick chimney jutting from a drift. The rest had vanished. She covered her mouth but didn't cry. She only looked toward Elias with a mix of fury and gratitude he'd seen before in broken people who wanted a reason bigger than chance. At mid-slope, Harlan's body appeared partly exposed under sheared boards. Elias knelt, brushed snow from the man's face, and found his eyes open but glassy. "Should have gone low," Elias whispered, closing them. The survivors said little on the way back. Each step pressed the same thought deeper. They'd laughed at the idea of living in Earth, but now the Earth was all that remained standing. Back inside, Dalton sank beside the stove again. "We need to send word to Springfield for help, but telegraph lines are gone and no horses'll move through that." Elias handed him a strip of jerky. "You won't need to send word. This kind of story carries itself." Later that day, when the sun finally cut through the clouds, they led more survivors into the shelter. 2 families dug out from a hayloft, a man found trapped beneath a wagon, a girl whose hands were frostbitten black at the tips, the space filled with breath and low murmur, but no panic. People stared at the curved earthen ceiling as though it were a cathedral dome carved by mercy itself. Dalton, usually silent, finally said, "Crow, I owe you a thing I don't like owing. You were right, plain as gravity." Elias didn't look up from the stove. "No one owes anyone for listening late." Whit gave a shaky grin. "Well, if you ever open a school for moles, I'll sign up." Laughter came then, hoarse, uncertain, but real. They were alive, and that was proof enough for now. When the fire burned steady that night, Dalton asked what everyone else had been thinking. "What'll we call this place if we rebuild?" Elias thought of the wind song across the vent pipes, a low hum that had become almost familiar. "Start with Alder Creek," he said. "End with something that remembers." He didn't add aloud the phrase that lingered in him. They mocked the underground winter house, until the storm took the roofs away. The wind outside gave one last hollow moan, as if signing its name. When the thaw finally came weeks later, Alder Creek no longer smelled of smoke, but of clean mud and cold water. The white had retreated from the hills in slow veins, revealing a landscape rearranged, new gullies carved where streets had been, fences folded into the earth like hairpins. What remained standing were things that had known how to bow: the millstone, the buried wagons, and the low crescent mound that covered Elias's winter house. The survivors cleared paths between drifts. Each day more emerged from makeshift shelters, 34 souls out of nearly 90. They moved differently now, slower, heads lower, as if balancing invisible roofs on their shoulders. Elias worked beside them but said little. His underground home had become a meeting place for cooking, storage, even sleep, its compact chambers proof that a shape born of humility could outlive arrogance. Through melted snow, the vent pipes gleamed dull silver at sunrise. Children thought they were strange chimneys that grew from the soil. When the first supply team from Springfield arrived, their horses refused to climb the muddy rise, so Dalton met them halfway. The officers listened to his account, staring at what little of the town still existed. "Never seen wind do this kind of work without fire to help it," one said. Dalton only pointed toward the mound. "Ask him," he replied. The next afternoon, Elias stood on the same spot where months ago his shovel had first struck frozen ground. The officer, a civil engineer named Weatherby, circled the structure, hands sunk deep in his coat. "You built this alone?" he asked. "First time, yes. Second time with the whole town watching." Weatherby crouched, testing the soil. "It's crude but right. Load distributes evenly. Internal temperature stable. You understood pressure differential better than most architects I've met." Elias wiped his hands on his coat. "Didn't need to understand much. Just watched how the prairie dogs survived last winter while men froze building higher." The engineer smiled faintly. You'd be willing to see it copied? The Bureau's planning frontier settlement manuals? A design like yours could save miles of timber. Elias hesitated. As long as they don't call it genius, it's just listening to the ground. That evening, he watched Dalton's men mark foundations for new buildings, half buried this time, sloped walls, entryways facing downwind. Children played along the berm, sliding on boards. Laughter returned to the ruined prairie, like small birds finding courage to sing again. Mrs. Fallon hung a tin plate near the entry of the earth house. She scratched words into it with a nail. In memory of the night the roofs left. Below that, smaller, shelter of Elias Crow. He tried to object, but she shook her head. A story needs a door, she said. This one already found its roof. When dusk bled across the plains, Elias climbed atop the mound. The soil was dry beneath his hands, faintly warm from the trapped heat below. He looked west. What once had been houses now were scars patterned by snowmelt, reflecting pink light. Dalton joined him quietly. You staying on here? For now. Maybe show folks how to build the next one wider. Fit more people at once. Dalton studied the horizon. We laughed because we thought the ground was loss. Turns out it's promise. Elias nodded. Everything upright forgets that sooner or later. Wind brushed past, gentle this time, testing the new walls sprouting below. The scent of thaw carried mud and renewal. For the first time in many months, he felt the sky not as a threat, but as balance above the earth's weight. He opened his ledger one last time, writing in small, even lines. Proof complete. The earth shelters those who respect it. Let designs follow humility, not glory. He closed the book, slid it into a slot carved in the inner wall, and sealed it under a thin layer of clay. Not as a treasure, just a record, waiting for the next storm to test it again. The prairie stretched silent. Light faded on the plate above the door, until only one word caught the last reflection of day. Shelter.